Hi, I'm Liam. At a lavish party meant to celebrate my brother's success, my own family treated me like I was part of the hired help. It's stunning, really, how the people who are supposed to see you most clearly can be the ones who are completely blind to who you are. Have you ever felt utterly invisible in your own home? Before I tell you the exact words my sister used that day, the phrase that felt like a slap in the face in front of dozens of people, leave a comment telling me where you're from and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happened when they were finally forced to open their eyes and see the man I had become. Returning to my family's estate in Greenwich after years away felt less like a homecoming and more like stepping onto a foreign planet where I no longer spoke the language. The long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees, led to the same imposing stone mansion I grew up in, but the warmth I vaguely remembered from childhood was gone, replaced by a cold, transactional silence. The main conflict wasn't something loud or explosive. It was a quiet, suffocating pressure. My older brother, Ethan, was the heir apparent to our father's business empire, the golden son destined for greatness. I was the quiet one, the one who had disappeared, and in their eyes, the one who had failed. My very presence was an awkward footnote in their grand narrative of success. This dynamic played out every single day, most often around the massive mahogany dining table. My father, Richard, would dominate the conversation, his voice booming as he detailed market acquisitions and corporate takeovers, his Rolex a constant, gleaming reminder of the time he was conquering. Ethan would sit at his right hand, a perfect echo, discussing stock options and dividend yields with a confidence that made it clear he was being groomed for the throne. I would try to join in, maybe share a story or an observation from my own life, but my words would just hang in the air, met with polite, vacant smiles before the conversation inevitably snapped back to the only thing that mattered to them: money and power. I wasn't just excluded, I was irrelevant. Ethan's contempt for me was a more personal, cutting brand of dismissal. He saw my quiet nature not as a personality trait but as a profound weakness, a stain on the family's reputation for ruthless ambition. He'd make casual, biting jokes at my expense, always with a smirk that invited others to laugh along. He'd talk about his new Porsche 911 in the garage next to our father's Mercedes S-Class, then glance at me and ask if I was still driving that old thing, knowing full well I didn't have a car at all. To him, I was a living, breathing symbol of mediocrity, and he used me as a dark backdrop to make his own light shine brighter. He never missed an opportunity to remind me, and everyone else, that I simply didn't belong in his world. My sister, Chloe, was a different story, but no less painful. Being younger, she had absorbed the family's values like a sponge. She idolized Ethan and saw our father as the ultimate measure of a man. Her dismissal of me wasn't as overtly cruel as Ethan's. It was more subtle, more insidious. It was in the way her eyes would glaze over when I started to speak, her attention drifting to her phone or to something more important across the room. She had learned from the best that I was not a person of consequence. My thoughts, my experiences, my very existence were simply not worth her time. Her indifference was a constant, silent judgment, confirming that in the family hierarchy I was firmly at the bottom. I remember one Christmas, years before I left for good, that crystallized everything. My father made a grand speech about legacy and ambition before presenting Ethan with a vintage Omega watch, a family heirloom he'd been promised for years. The moment was thick with significance, a symbolic passing of the torch. A few minutes later, my father slid a small, elegantly wrapped box across the table to me. I opened it to find a generic, expensive but impersonal money clip. The message couldn't have been clearer. Ethan was the future, an investment in the family dynasty. I was an afterthought, an obligation to be managed with a polite but ultimately meaningless gesture. It was never about the gift, it was about the worth assigned to each of us. So, when I finally returned to that house, I wasn't naive enough to expect a welcome parade. Still, the depth of their disinterest was a cold shock to the system. They never asked me any real questions about where I had been or what I had done. They simply filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. In their story, I had drifted, failed, and finally come crawling back to the safety of the family fortune because I couldn't make it on my own. My silence on the matter wasn't seen as a choice, but as an admission of shame. They treated me with a sort of weary pity, offering me a room in the vast empty mansion, as if I were a distant cousin who had fallen on hard times, a charity case they had to endure. The announcement of the garden party to celebrate Ethan's latest business triumph only amplified my sense of alienation. The estate was transformed into a showcase of wealth and power. Fleets of catering trucks lined the service entrance, florists arranged impossibly beautiful displays on the manicured lawns, and the air crackled with an energy of self-congratulation that I felt completely detached from. I was expected to attend, of course. My presence was required as part of the family portrait, the quiet, unassuming brother who served as a perfect, dull contrast to Ethan's brilliance. I was a prop in their carefully staged play, and I was expected to know my lines, which consisted of staying silent and looking grateful. But as I stood in my room looking out the window at the white tents and glittering lights being set up on the lawn, I didn't feel the familiar sting of resentment or the dull ache of inadequacy. Instead, a strange and unfamiliar calm washed over me. The years I had spent away from them, in a world they couldn't even begin to imagine, had forged something new inside of me. They had built their lives on a foundation of status, perception, and material wealth. I had built mine on something else entirely, something real and solid. They believed they had my entire story figured out. They were about to find out they were profoundly, devastatingly wrong. The day of the party was a spectacle of organized chaos, a testament to my father's belief that success wasn't just about having money, but about making sure everyone knew you had it. From my bedroom window, I watched as an army of caterers in crisp white uniforms transformed the back lawn into something out of a magazine. White tents bloomed across the grass. A string quartet tuned their instruments near the rose garden, and a bar stocked with premium liquor was being set up by the pool. It was all so perfect, so polished, and I felt like a smudge on a pristine painting. I wasn't part of the celebration. I was just a spectator with a better view than the hired help, though in my family's eyes, the distinction was becoming increasingly blurry. The sheer scale of it all was meant to impress, to project an image of untouchable power, but all it did for me was highlight the cavernous emotional distance between me and the people I was supposed to call family. My father found me in the library that morning, pretending to read a book. He didn't say hello. He just stood there for a moment, adjusting the cuff of his custom-tailored shirt, his Patek Philippe watch catching the light. "Ethan tells me you'll be joining us tonight," he said, his tone flat. As if confirming the attendance of a distant relative, he was obligated to invite. "Try to mingle. Don't just stand in a corner. It looks bad." There was no warmth, no encouragement, just a command wrapped in disappointment. He was telling me not to embarrass him with my quietness, with my very presence. He saw me not as his son, but as a potential social liability, a loose thread in the perfect tapestry he was weaving for his guests. He then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of his unspoken verdict. "You are not enough." A little later, I ran into Ethan in the hallway. He was on his way out, already dressed in a suit that probably cost more than I had made in the last year. He was radiating an almost unbearable smugness, a man who had never known a day of self-doubt. He stopped, looking me up and down with a condescending smirk. "Don't have anything decent to wear, do you?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Dad left one of his old suits in your closet. It's a Brioni, probably a little dated, but it's better than whatever you brought back with you." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem brotherly, but felt more like a shove. "Just try to keep up tonight, little brother. The people coming are in a different league. You wouldn't want to bore them with stories about, well, whatever it is you do." Chloe's contribution to my morning of microaggressions was perhaps the most telling. I found her in the kitchen, directing the florist with the authority of a seasoned general. She was barking orders about the precise shade of cream for the roses, her voice sharp and impatient. She saw me walk in but didn't acknowledge me until she needed something. "Liam, be useful and get me a glass of water, will you? And not tap water," she commanded, waving a dismissive hand in my direction without even making eye contact. I was just an object in the room, a pair of hands to fetch things for her. The ease with which she relegated me to the role of a servant was chilling. It wasn't born of malice, but something far worse, a complete and utter certainty that I was beneath her notice unless I could perform some minor task. As the afternoon wore on, I went to my room to get ready, The Brioni suit my father had left for me was hanging in the closet, a silent accusation. It was beautifully made, the fabric impossibly fine, but putting it on felt like putting on a costume for a role I didn't want to play. Looking at myself in the mirror, I didn't see a son of the house. I saw an imposter. The suit fit perfectly, but it felt alien, a shell designed to make me look like I belonged in their world. Every button I fastened felt like another bar locking me into a cage of their expectations. A deep, weary sadness settled over me. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the performance, tired of the constant judgment, tired of hoping for a connection that was never going to materialize. Walking down the grand curved staircase, I could already hear the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses from the terrace. My family was at the entrance. A formidable unit of charm and power. My father, laughing heartily with a senator. Ethan, effortlessly captivating a group of investors. Chloe, gliding through the crowd like she was born for it. They moved with a seamless, practiced grace, a closed circle that was impossible to penetrate. I paused on the last step, an invisible man watching a scene from a life that was supposed to be his. They hadn't even noticed my arrival. I could have turned around and gone back to my room, and I doubt anyone would have missed me. That realization was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. This feeling wasn't new. I was suddenly thrown back to my 16th birthday party, held in this very same house. It was supposed to be my day, but my father had used it as a networking event, and Ethan, who had just gotten his acceptance letter to Wharton, stole the spotlight. I remember standing by the pool, holding a piece of my own birthday cake that someone had handed me, watching my father put his arm around Ethan and proudly introduce him as the future of the company. I had spent most of that night alone, feeling like a ghost at my own celebration. It was the first time I understood that in my family, value wasn't inherent. It was earned through achievements they could brag about, and I had never given them anything worth bragging about. I forced myself to step onto the terrace, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. I tried to make conversation with a couple my parents had known for years. "Liam, Richard told us you were back," the woman said with a strained, overly bright smile. "What have you been up to all this time?" But before I could even formulate an answer, her husband's eyes darted over my shoulder. "Is that David Harrison from the board of Morgan Stanley?" he whispered to his wife, and just like that they were gone, moving toward a more valuable connection. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. It was another small cut, another confirmation of my place in this social ecosystem. I was a dead end, a conversation to be politely escaped as quickly as possible. The party was in full swing now. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the whole scene. The string quartet was playing something classical and elegant, the sound mixing with the laughter of people who had never known failure. It was a perfect picture of American aristocracy, a world built on legacy, ambition, and the quiet, brutal efficiency of modern capitalism. And I was walking through it all, a foreign body that the system was trying to reject. I saw the way people's eyes slid past me, the polite but firm way conversations would shift when I approached. I wasn't just being ignored. I was being actively edited out of the scene, erased in real time by 100 tiny social cues. Ethan found me again near the bar, this time with a prominent real estate developer in tow. "And this is my younger brother, Liam," he said, his arm draped over my shoulder in a mockery of affection. "He's the artistic one in the family, took some time off to find himself." He winked at the developer, a shared joke at my expense. The man chuckled politely, his eyes scanning me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The label, the artistic one, was their code for the one who doesn't make money. It was a neat little box they put me in to explain my deviation from the family script, a way to dismiss my life without having to understand it. The humiliation was a slow burn, a poison seeping into my veins. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching all of this happen to someone else. The noise of the party faded into a dull roar in my ears. The endless smiling faces, the clinking glasses, the self-congratulatory chatter, it all seemed so absurd, so hollow. I was reaching a breaking point, a quiet, internal snapping of a cord that had been stretched taut for years. I just wanted it to be over. As I stood there, nursing my drink and contemplating the quickest way to disappear, I saw her, my sister, Chloe, was making her way toward me, a group of her friends trailing behind her like ladies in waiting. She had a cruel, glittering smile on her face, the kind she wore right before she was about to deliver a killing blow. I braced myself, knowing that whatever was coming next would be the final cut. Chloe glided toward me, her silk dress shimmering under the party lights, her friends flanking her like a royal guard. Her smile was a weapon, sharp and aimed directly at me. I saw the whole sequence of events play out in her eyes before she even opened her mouth. This was going to be her moment, a public execution of my already non-existent status within the family. She was going to use me as a punchline to entertain her friends, to reaffirm her own place in the hierarchy by pushing me further down. I didn't try to move or look away. I just stood there, a statue waiting for the final chisel blow that would either shatter me or reveal what was underneath. I felt a strange sense of peace in that moment, the kind of calm that comes when you know the worst is about to happen and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. It was, in a way, a relief. The waiting was finally over. She stopped right in front of me, letting the silence hang for a moment to draw the attention of those nearby. Her friends giggled in anticipation. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone in our little circle to hear, she looked me up and down, a theatrical once-over, and said, "Nice suit, Liam. Did they run out of uniforms for the staff?" The words landed with a sickening thud, a perfect calculated strike designed for maximum humiliation. It wasn't just an insult. It was a public declaration of my worthlessness. She wasn't just saying I didn't belong with them. She was saying I belonged with the people serving them. It was the ultimate expression of their view of me, a functional object, but not a person of any real significance in their world. The laughter that followed was immediate and sharp, a burst of sound that felt like shattered glass against my skin. Ethan, who had been watching from a few feet away, threw his head back and let out a booming laugh, slapping the back of a nearby guest in shared amusement. He caught my eye and gave me a little shrug, as if to say, "What can you do? She's got a point." His enjoyment of my public shaming was raw and undisguised, but it was my father's reaction that truly cut me to the core. He wasn't laughing. He just looked at me, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated disappointment. He wasn't disappointed in Chloe for her cruelty. He was disappointed in me for being the target, for creating a scene, for being so utterly incapable of fitting in that I had become a joke. In his eyes, I was a failure not because of what I did, but because of who I was. That look was the final, definitive rejection I had been waiting for my entire life. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It settled. The years of trying, of hoping, of quietly aching for their approval, all of that just evaporated. The pain was still there, a dull throb in my chest, but it was distant now, like a memory of a wound, rather than the wound itself. I didn't feel anger or the urge to defend myself. I just felt done. It was the end of a very long, very lonely road. I looked from Chloe's smug face to Ethan's laughing one, and finally to my father's stony disappointment, and I saw them for what they were, strangers. They were people I shared blood with, but I had no connection to them. They didn't know the first thing about me, and they had never cared to learn. The Brioni suit I was wearing suddenly felt less like a costume and more like armor. It was their world, and I was just passing through. The laughter eventually died down, replaced by an awkward, heavy silence. A few of the nearby guests looked away, a flicker of discomfort in their eyes. The perfect, glittering surface of the party had been momentarily disturbed by this display of casual family cruelty. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any angry retort could have. I just held Chloe's gaze, my expression unreadable. I didn't offer a defense or a comeback. I just let her words hang in the air, a testament to her character, not mine. It was in that tense, quiet moment that I first heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound from far away. It was a low, steady pulse, almost imperceptible beneath the soft melody of the string quartet, but it was there, a sound I knew better than my own name. At first, no one else seemed to notice. The conversation started to tentatively bubble up again as people tried to move past the awkwardness, but the sound grew steadily louder, more insistent. It was a deep, percussive thumping, a mechanical heartbeat that was completely alien to the genteel atmosphere of the garden party. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a news helicopter or the smooth hum of a private jet. This was something different. It was heavier, more powerful. It was the sound of authority. Heads began to turn, conversations faltered, and the string quartet trailed off, one instrument at a time, until the only sounds were the clinking of ice in glasses and this relentless, approaching beat. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension, one of confusion and curiosity. My father. Richard looked visibly annoyed, his jaw tight. He hated anything that disrupted his perfectly orchestrated events. He scanned the darkening sky, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. Ethan squinted, shielding his eyes with his hand. "What the hell is that?" he muttered to the man beside him. "Probably just some billionaire trying to make an entrance." But there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. The sound was too aggressive, too official. It didn't belong here. In this manicured world of old money and corporate power, it was an intruder, an unknown variable in an equation my father had spent a lifetime controlling. The sense of unease was palpable, spreading through the crowd like a ripple in a pond. Then it appeared. A sleek black helicopter crested the line of ancient oak trees at the edge of the property. It was stark, menacing, and utterly devoid of any corporate branding. Its design was unmistakably military. It didn't circle or hesitate. It moved with a singular, unwavering purpose, its destination clearly the wide, empty stretch of lawn, right in the middle of the party. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This wasn't a guest. This was an invasion. The helicopter's powerful rotors sent a shockwave of air across the lawn, whipping at the elegant floral arrangements and sending carefully folded napkins scattering like frightened birds. The perfect illusion of the party was being literally blown apart. The aircraft descended with a controlled, deafening roar, its landing gear touching down on the perfectly manicured grass with a solid, definitive thud. The noise was immense, a physical force that vibrated through the ground and up into our bones. The engine began to wind down, but the silence it left behind was even more profound, filled with 1,000 unasked questions. The machine just sat there, a dark-hued, powerful beast, resting in a field of white linen and crystal. Its presence was a stark, brutal contrast to the frivolous luxury surrounding it. Every single person at that party, from the most powerful CEO to the youngest socialite, was frozen, their eyes locked on the side door of the helicopter, waiting to see who or what would emerge from this impossible interruption. For the first time all night, I wasn't the center of negative attention. In fact, no one was looking at me at all. They had completely forgotten the small, pathetic drama of the family failure. All their focus was on the black helicopter that had just torn a hole in their reality. As the rotor blade slowly spun to a stop, a side door slid open with a sharp, mechanical hiss. The inside was dark, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The suspense was unbearable. My father looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Ethan stood with his mouth slightly agape, his usual arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. And Chloe, my sister, who had just tried to reduce me to nothing, was staring at the aircraft with wide, fearful eyes. The power dynamic of the entire evening had just been completely and irrevocably shattered. Then, out of the dark interior of the helicopter, a single, polished black boot appeared, planting itself firmly on the manicured lawn. It was followed by another, and then a man in a crisp, dark military uniform stepped out, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of years of discipline. A second man, identical in dress and demeanor, followed right behind him. They didn't pause to survey the scene or acknowledge the stunned crowd of elites. Their movements were precise, deliberate, and utterly focused. They scanned the area for a brief second, their eyes sweeping past the senator, the CEOs, and the socialites until they locked onto a single target. They locked onto me. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, and the space between us, 100 yards of perfectly cut grass that suddenly felt like a battlefield. A murmur rippled through the guests, a wave of whispers and confused glances. Who were these men? What did they want? I could see my father take a half-step forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was the master of this universe, and these men were an unsanctioned, unwelcome intrusion. He opened his mouth, likely to unleash a torrent of threats about trespassing and calling his lawyers, but no sound came out. Something about the soldiers' unwavering posture, their sheer, unshakable confidence, gave him pause. They radiated an aura of authority that didn't come from a stock portfolio or a family name. It was something harder, more fundamental. It was the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself, and for the first time in his life, my father seemed to recognize a force greater than his own. I, on the other hand, felt a strange and profound sense of calm. This wasn't a surprise. It was an inevitability I had been living with for years. It was the collision of my two separate lives, the quiet, unassuming failure my family saw, and the man I had actually become. I had always known this day might come, a day when the curtain would be pulled back, but I never imagined it would happen like this on a stage of their own making, in the middle of their celebration of everything I wasn't supposed to be. I didn't feel triumph or a desire for revenge. I just felt a quiet, resolute finality. The performance was over. My real life had just walked onto the set, and there was no turning back. It was time for them to see. The two soldiers began to walk. They moved in perfect sync, their boots making soft, rhythmic thuds on the grass. They didn't march, they strode, a purposeful, unstoppable advance across the lawn. The crowd instinctively parted before them, creating a clear path directly to where I stood by the bar. They walked past Ethan, who looked as if he had been turned to stone, his glass of champagne frozen halfway to his lips. They walked past Chloe, whose face was a pale canvas of shock and dawning horror. They walked past decades of accumulated wealth and influence as if it were all just scenery, completely irrelevant to their mission. Every eye at that party followed their progress, and with each step they took, the focus of the entire evening shifted, moving from my brother Dom, the celebrated heir Dom, to me, the forgotten son. I watched Ethan's face closely. His arrogance, the smug certainty that had defined him his entire life, was gone. It had been stripped away in a matter of seconds, replaced by a raw, naked confusion. He looked from the approaching soldiers to me, his brow furrowed as his mind raced, trying to process this impossible scenario. I could almost see the gears turning, the frantic search for a logical explanation. Was this a prank, a mistake? Was I in some kind of trouble? The one possibility that his mind couldn't even begin to formulate was the truth, that these men were here for me, that I was the reason for this display of power, that the brother he had dismissed as a weak artistic failure was someone of consequence. The foundation of his world was cracking, and he didn't even know why. My gaze shifted to Chloe. She was clutching the arm of one of her friends, her knuckles white. The cruel, mocking light in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. The words she had thrown at me just minutes before, "Did they run out of uniforms for the staff?" now hung in the air with a terrible, biting irony. She had tried to relegate me to the role of a servant, and now, here were men in uniform, crossing a field of millionaires, and their destination was me. Her world was one of social cues, of subtle put-downs and hierarchies built on wealth and appearance. This was different. This was real power, blunt and undeniable. And it was a language she didn't speak. In that moment, she looked small, lost and utterly powerless. The soldiers were closer now, only 20 feet away. The silence was absolute. The string quartet had long since fallen quiet, and even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the weight of every single person's stare. They weren't just looking at me anymore. They were studying me, re-evaluating everything they thought they knew. I was no longer the awkward footnote, the embarrassing relative. I was a mystery, an enigma at the center of an unfolding drama they couldn't comprehend. The power in that moment was intoxicating, but it wasn't a power I wielded over them. It was the simple, quiet power of the truth, a truth I had carried alone for so many years, and it was finally about to be revealed. A memory, sharp and clear, surfaced in my mind. It was from years ago, in a dusty, remote location thousands of miles from this manicured lawn. I was sitting with my mentor, a man who had seen something in me that no one else had, not even myself. He was a general, a man who had commanded thousands, but spoke in a quiet, thoughtful voice. "Liam," he had told me, looking out at a barren landscape, "never confuse noise with strength. The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. True authority is silent. It's earned, not declared. It's something people feel in your presence before you ever say a word." His words had become the bedrock of the man I had built myself into, far away from the noise of my family's ambition. The two soldiers came to a halt exactly 3 feet in front of me. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their posture ramrod straight, their faces grim and professional. The entire party, a collection of some of the most powerful people in the state, was frozen in a collective tableau of disbelief. My father, my brother, my sister, they were all just part of the audience now, spectators to a scene they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. The lead soldier, a man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a jaw set like granite, looked directly at me. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any explanation to the stunned crowd. His focus was singular. He was waiting for my acknowledgement, a silent question passing between us. The air was thick with unspoken questions, a palpable tension that felt like it could shatter glass. This was the precipice, the final moment before the fall. Everything that had happened in my life, every dismissal, every quiet humiliation, every lonely year spent forging a different identity, had led to this single, surreal point in time. The two men stood before me, symbols of a world my family knew nothing about. They were the bridge between who I was and who they thought I was. The lead soldier took a short, sharp breath, preparing to speak, preparing to deliver the words that would shatter their world and redefine mine forever. The entire garden party held its breath with him, waiting for the climax that was about to break over them like a tidal wave. The lead soldier's eyes were locked on mine. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, and in their depths I saw no judgment. No curiosity about the opulent circus around us, only a focused, unwavering sense of purpose. It was the look of a man who dealt in absolutes, in life-and-death realities that made a garden party in Greenwich seem like a child's game. The entire world had gone silent, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind through the oak trees and the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching this scene unfold from a great height. My past and my present were about to collide right here on this perfect lawn, and I was the only person in the world who knew what was coming. I simply waited for the impact, a calm acceptance settling over me like a heavy blanket. Then, with a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, the soldier raised his right hand to the brim of his cap. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a salute, a gesture of profound, ingrained respect that was completely alien in this environment of backslapping deals and insincere smiles. The snap of his gloved fingers against the stiff material was a gunshot in the silence, a sound that carried more weight and authority than any word my father had ever spoken. In that single, disciplined motion, he communicated a hierarchy that had nothing to do with bank accounts or family lineage. It was a recognition of a different kind of power, a power earned in places these people couldn't even imagine, and it was directed solely, unequivocally, at me, the forgotten son, the family failure. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, meant for my ears alone but carrying with an undeniable force in the heavy silence. "General," he said, the word cutting through the evening air like a diamond, "you're needed. The situation is critical." That one word, "General," hung there, suspended in the disbelief of 100 stunned onlookers. It was a title, a rank, a reality so far removed from their understanding of me that it might as well have been a word from a foreign language. It didn't just contradict their narrative of my failure, it obliterated it. It took the image of me they had so carefully constructed, the quiet, artistic drifter, and shattered it into a million unrecognizable pieces, leaving them staring at the impossible truth of the man who stood in my place. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd, a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. It was followed by a silence so deep, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Every single face, the senator, the CEOs, the investors, the socialites, turned from the soldier to me. Their eyes, which had slid past me with polite disinterest all night, were now wide, locked on me with a frantic intensity. They were re-evaluating, recalculating, their minds scrambling to reconcile the man they had dismissed with the title they had just heard. I was no longer an awkward footnote. I was the headline, the mystery they had all missed, and the sudden, terrifying shift in my perceived value was a palpable force, an earthquake shaking the very foundations of their social order. I watched Ethan's face. The color drained from it so fast he looked like a marble statue. His smug, arrogant smirk, the one he had worn like a crown his entire life, dissolved into a slack-jawed expression of utter horror. The Porsche in the driveway, the Wharton degree on his wall, the millions in his portfolio. All the markers of his superiority were rendered meaningless in an instant. He was staring at me, but he wasn't seeing his weak little brother anymore. He was seeing a ghost, a stranger who had somehow stolen my face. He was seeing his entire worldview, a world where he was the undisputed king, crumble into dust. His reality was built on the certainty of my failure, and that foundation had just been dynamited. My gaze found Chloe. Her cruel, mocking smile was frozen on her face, a grotesque mask of a triumph that had just turned to ash in her mouth. Her friends, who had been giggling with her moments before, had taken a subtle step back, as if her proximity had suddenly become toxic. The irony of her words, "Did they run out of uniforms for the staff?" was now a physical presence, a suffocating weight in the air between us. She had tried to humiliate me by associating me with a uniform, and now, the most respected uniform of all was saluting me. The terror in her eyes wasn't just about being wrong, it was the dawning realization that her casual cruelty had been directed at a man whose power she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then I looked at my father, Richard, the Titan, the patriarch, the man whose approval was the sun my entire childhood had orbited. His face, usually a controlled mask of command, was contorted with a profound, shattering bewilderment. His brilliant business mind, so quick to analyze threats and opportunities, had hit a wall. The word general was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit into any of his carefully constructed equations about success and failure. He stared at me, his eyes wide, as if seeing me for the very first time. He wasn't looking at a disappointing son. He was looking at a complete stranger, a man of immense authority who had been living under his roof. And his inability to process this truth was a system failure of catastrophic proportions. He made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp, as his hand flew to his chest, clutching at the expensive fabric of his suit. His legs gave out from under him. The master of this universe, the man who had never shown a moment of weakness, collapsed onto the perfectly manicured grass of his own estate. He wasn't brought down by a rival or a market crash. He was felled by a single word, a single truth about the son he had written off. His fall was slow, almost surreal, and as his body hit the ground, the last vestiges of the party's perfect illusion shattered completely. The king had fallen, not from a blow, but from the sheer weight of his own blindness. The scene erupted into chaos. A woman screamed. People surged forward, shouting for a doctor, their voices a panicked chorus. The elegant garden party dissolved into a frantic scramble around my father's fallen form. Ethan and Chloe rushed to his side, their faces pale with a new kind of terror, but in the midst of the pandemonium, a strange bubble of silence seemed to form around me and the two soldiers. They hadn't flinched. Their focus remained entirely on me, their expressions unchanged. The collapse of my father was a distraction, a piece of civilian drama that was irrelevant to our purpose. My family's world was imploding, but my world was calling, and I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as steel where my duty now lay. I looked at the chaos, my father on the ground, my brother shouting his name, my sister weeping, and I felt a deep, hollow ache. There was no victory in this, no triumphant satisfaction. There was only a profound and bottomless pity for them. They had spent their lives chasing a hollow definition of success, building a kingdom of wealth and status, only to have it all crumble because they couldn't see the value of a person standing right in front of them. My mentor was right. True authority was silent. It wasn't something you announced. It was something you were, and my entire life, they had been too loud to hear my silence, too blind to see what was right there in plain sight. I gave the lead soldier a short, sharp nod, my answer to his summons. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of my duty. Then I turned my back on the scene. I turned my back on my father lying on the grass, on my stunned brother and my weeping sister. I gave them one last fleeting glance, not of anger or triumph, but of a quiet, sad farewell. The Liam they knew, the one they had created to fit their narrative, was gone forever, left behind on that manicured lawn with the wreckage of their lives. A different man walked away, a man they had never known, heading toward the waiting helicopter and a life of purpose they could never understand. My path was clear. and for the first time, it felt completely and utterly my own. As I stepped into the helicopter, the roar of the engines enveloped me, creating a wall of sound that shut out the world I was leaving behind. The door slid shut with a heavy, final thud, and we lifted off the ground. Through the window, I could see the estate shrinking below, a perfect, glittering diorama of a life that was no longer mine. The white tents, the string lights, the swimming pool glowing an eerie blue, it all became smaller and smaller. I saw the flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance turning into the long driveway, a frantic response to a crisis I had unintentionally caused. But I didn't feel guilt, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing at all. I turned away from the window and faced forward, toward the mission, toward the life I had chosen. The distance wasn't just physical anymore, it was absolute. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was stark and professional. One of the soldiers, a major named Evans, handed me a tablet. The screen glowed with encrypted satellite maps and urgent intelligence reports. "Sir, the situation in the strait has escalated," he said, his voice all business. "We have a 3-hour window." I took the tablet, my mind instantly shifting gears, processing threat assessments and tactical options. There was no time for reflection on the family drama I had just exited. That world of perceived slights and social hierarchies felt like a dream, a fiction. This was reality. The weight of my real responsibilities settled back onto my shoulders, a familiar and grounding pressure. Here, my worth wasn't measured by my last name or my bank account, but by the decisions I made and the lives that depended on them. I was no longer Liam, the son. I was General Miller, and I had work to do. It was months before I heard from them again. The world I inhabit doesn't have much room for personal correspondence. I was at a forward operating base in a place that was all dust and rock, a landscape the color of rust. A communications officer handed me a sealed packet that had come through a secure diplomatic channel. Inside was a single, handwritten letter on my father's heavy, cream-colored stationery. But the handwriting wasn't his. It was Ethan's. I almost threw it away, but a flicker of morbid curiosity made me open it. His writing was a chaotic scrawl, words crossed out, sentences trailing off. It was the letter of a man whose entire reality had been dismantled, and he was desperately trying to piece it back together. But all the pieces were the wrong shape now. His letter wasn't an apology. It was an interrogation born of sheer panic. He wrote that my father had survived the heart attack, but was a ghost of the man he once was. He spent his days in the library, staring out the window, refusing to speak about that night. Ethan was running the company now, but the letter was filled with his own fear and inadequacy. "Who are you, Liam?" he wrote. "What did you do? Why did you let us believe you were a failure?" He was asking for an explanation, not to understand me, but to understand what this meant for him, for the family's reputation. He described how the story of that night had leaked, becoming a bizarre legend among their social circle. He was no longer the golden son. He was the brother of the Phantom General, a supporting character in a story he couldn't control. Chloe's attempt at contact was different. It came as a single voicemail, forwarded to a secure line. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of its usual sharp, confident edge. It was thin, reedy, and choked with tears. She sobbed her way through a disjointed apology, repeating the words, "I'm so sorry, Liam. I had no idea," over and over again. But her apology wasn't for the years of dismissal or the casual cruelty. It was for that one specific insult, the one that had backfired so spectacularly. She was apologizing for her mistake, for misjudging my power, not for her character. I could hear the terror in her voice, the fear of a socialite who had publicly insulted a man of immense, mysterious authority. She wasn't sorry for hurting her brother. She was terrified that she had angered a general. I deleted the message after one listen. I never replied to either of them. Not out of anger or a desire for revenge, but because there was simply nothing left to say. The chasm between my life and theirs had become an uncrossable ocean. Answering their questions would have been like trying to describe the color blue to someone who was born blind. They wouldn't understand the years of discipline, the sacrifices, the reasons I chose a life of service over a life of luxury. They saw my life through the lens of power and status, and they would only ever see my rank, not the man who had earned it. My silence wasn't a punishment. It was a final act of separation. My family was no longer the group of people in that Greenwich mansion. It was the men and women I served with, the ones who knew my call sign, but not my last name. I learned about the final fallout through a small article in a financial newspaper a year later. Richard had officially retired, citing health reasons. The empire he had built with such ruthless ambition was now fully in Ethan's hands. The article painted Ethan as a capable successor, but I could read between the lines. It spoke of a new, more cautious direction for the company, a period of consolidation. Those were corporate euphemisms for a loss of nerve. The brash, arrogant confidence that had defined my father and brother was gone, replaced by a fearful, hesitant leadership. The Titan had fallen, and his heir was just a prince playing at being king, haunted by the ghost of a brother who had become more powerful than he could have ever imagined. The family's legendary influence had begun its slow, quiet decay. About a month after that article, a small, heavily insured package arrived for me. Inside, nestled in a black velvet box, was the vintage Omega watch, the heirloom my father had given Ethan all those years ago. There was no letter, just a small, crisp card with my father's embossed initials. Below them, in his shaky, unfamiliar handwriting, were 5 words. "This should have been yours." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an act of love. It was a concession, a final, desperate attempt to assign me a value he could understand, to put me back into a box he recognized. It was the only way he knew how to say he was wrong. I looked at the watch, its gold case gleaming. It was a beautiful object, a symbol of a legacy I had never wanted, and a validation I no longer needed. I closed the box and put it in the bottom of my footlocker, an artifact from a forgotten tomb. I'm telling you this story from a place that's about as far from Greenwich, Connecticut, as you can get. The sun is coming up, painting a sky of orange and purple over a harsh yet beautiful landscape of mountains and sand. I don't think about that night often. When I do, it's not with anger or satisfaction. I just feel a quiet sadness for the family I lost. Or maybe the one I never really had. They built their world on a foundation of money and power, and in the end it was a truth they couldn't comprehend that brought it all crashing down. I didn't need to defeat them. I just needed to become myself. And in finding my own path, my own purpose, I left their world so far behind that it can't even touch me anymore. I found my own kind of peace. Not in a mansion, but out here, under an open sky. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back on it all, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about the quiet, unshakable power of defining your own worth. For so long, I allowed my family's perception to be my reality. I was the reflection they cast, quiet, unsuccessful, a disappointment. I let their definition of success, measured in stock prices and luxury brands, become the only yardstick I used for myself. But the truth is, their yardstick was never meant to measure a life like mine. The most important journey you can take is the one that leads you away from the opinions of others and toward your own unwavering truth. It's a hard road, often a lonely one, but it's the only one that leads to a place of genuine peace and self-respect. You see, my story isn't about becoming a general. That's just the detail, the plot twist. The real story is about what happens when you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you were never welcome. Instead of trying to change their minds, I focused on changing my world. I built a life based on values they couldn't understand: duty, honor, service, and a purpose greater than myself. The goal shouldn't be to make them see your value. It should be to build a life so full of your own value that their opinion becomes completely irrelevant. Success isn't about making a grand entrance that silences your critics. It's about living a life so authentic and meaningful that their noise fades into the background, unable to touch you. True strength, I discovered, isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience or applause. My father and brother believed strength was about dominance, about being the loudest voice, about ensuring everyone knew their power. But that kind of power is fragile, built on the validation of others. The strength I found is quieter. It's the discipline to wake up every day and work towards something you believe in, even when no one is watching. It's the integrity to hold on to your principles when it's easier to compromise. It's the resilience to get back up after being knocked down by the very people who were supposed to support you. That kind of strength doesn't need to be announced. It's felt. It's a silent authority that comes from within. For years, I think a part of me was desperately waiting for their approval, for a single moment where they would look at me and finally see me. That night, with the helicopter on the lawn, I realized the ultimate freedom isn't getting the validation you crave. It's realizing you no longer need it. Their shock, their fear, their disbelief, it didn't bring me joy. It just showed me how small their world truly was. The real victory is when you can look at the people whose opinions once defined you and feel nothing but a distant, quiet pity. When you are so secure in who you are and what you've built, their judgment loses all its power. It becomes just noise, and you can finally walk away, not in anger but in peace. Don't misunderstand me. Letting go of that pain isn't easy. It's a process, but the goal isn't to forget what happened or to pretend it didn't hurt. The goal is to grow so much that the memory of that pain no longer has the power to define your present. You outgrow it. You build a life so much bigger and more meaningful than the box they tried to put you in that you can look back at that box and barely recognize the person who used to live inside it. It's not about forgiving them for your own sake. It's about becoming so completely yourself that their actions become a footnote in your story, not the headline. Your life becomes the main event, and they are just distant characters from a previous chapter. So, I want to ask you to think about your own life. You don't need a helicopter or a dramatic reveal. Your moment of truth can be a quiet decision you make for yourself. It can be the choice to start a new career, to leave a toxic relationship, to pursue a passion that others dismiss as foolish. It's the moment you decide to stop living by someone else's script and start writing your own. Find your purpose, the thing that gives you a sense of value that no one can take away. Build your life on that foundation, brick by quiet brick. Your success won't be measured by their applause, but by the solid ground you feel beneath your own 2 feet. Your worth is not a topic for debate. It is a fact. Don't ever let anyone, not even the people who are supposed to love you the most, convince you otherwise. Your path is your own, and its value is not determined by how well it aligns with the expectations of others. It's measured by the integrity, purpose, and character you bring to the journey. Live a life that is so true to you that it needs no explanation and no defense. That is the ultimate victory, and it's a victory that you, and only you, can achieve for yourself. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.